Good afternoon and welcome to the Korea Society. My name is Nikita Desai. I'm the Director for Policy and Corporate Programs, and we're delighted to have Brandon Gauthier here to present on changing American perceptions of North Korea since 1948. We're also grateful to Brandon as he's writing a brief history of the Korea Society for our 60th anniversary taking place next year. We will be leaning forward with a new series on emerging scholars and keeping an eye on the next generation of scholars on Korea. It's a series that's been made possible by the generosity of Philip Sherman, who's here with us in our audience today. So thank you, Phil. Brandon Gauthier completed his doctorate in modern history at Fordham University in May 2016. Specializing in the study of the United States and East Asia, his work examines the history of U.S. DPRK relations since 1948. Gauthier's research specifically historicizes competing cultural and political visions of North Korea in American society and explains the process through which integrated links between culture, identity, and foreign policy shaped U.S. DPRK diplomatic history. Brandon's thesis is exceptional and original in examining the shifting perceptions from an American viewpoint, and we hope to look into it for solutions on how we can approach North Korea in the future. So please welcome Brandon Gauthier.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. It's a great pleasure. Nice to see you all here. I'd like to thank Nikki and Stephen Norper at the Korea Society for having me. This talk is going to depart from the focus of many excellent presentations here at the Korea Society over the last year. I'm not going to discuss recent contemporary events in North Korea or potential negotiating strategies for dealing with Kim Jong-un's regime. Instead, I will speak about some of the key assumptions in U.S. society about North Korea since 1948. In doing so, my ultimate purpose is to encourage greater understanding of why Americans think the way they do about North Korea in the present. In turn, I seek to reflect on how those views, alongside actual events on the Korea Peninsula, have helped shape American foreign policy vis-à-vis Pyongyang. Currently, the U.S. public has myriad reasons to perceive Kim Jong-un, the current leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, North Korea, in the worst possible light. As North Korea periodically conducts nuclear and ballistic missile tests, maintains one of the world's worst human rights records, and manufactures one international crisis after another to heighten support for its ruling regime at home, Americans often perceive Kim as either an insane dictator or as a reckless young man with little understanding of the dangerous stakes at hand. In this regard, policymakers and prominent publications in the United States still frequently mock the North Korean leadership and express bewilderment at its actions. All too rarely do they emphasize that a calculated strategy might drive Pyongyang's behavior. For example, former GOP presidential candidate Marco Rubio and senator from Florida, as he put it in February 2016, Kim Jong-un is, quote, a lunatic with a hydrogen bomb. The New Yorker's January 18th, 2016 cover offered its readers little better. It depicted Kim as an infantilized toddler playing with toy missiles. These views reflect the continuation of a deeply rooted pattern in U.S. society of perceiving North Korea's leaders as devoid of rational agency. Since the inception of the North Korean state, outspoken voices in the American press have described its leadership as either pawns or foreign powers, or as madmen with no understanding of their actions. The DPRK's founder, Kim Il-sung, as most sources in the American press would argue from 1948 until the late 1960s, was nothing more than an odious puppet who took orders from the Soviet Union and/or China. Much of the general public, as a result, had little reason to believe that Kim Il-sung had any ability to shape the national destiny of North Korea outside the confines of monolithic communist world narratives. This reality changed in the 1970s when journalists and policymakers began to recognize that the DPRK acted independently of its allies in Moscow and Beijing. But a new reductive stereotype took shape in the process. Kim Il-sung and then his son and successor, Kim Jong-il, were impossible to understand and even irrational as that mounting narrative went. Media sources begin to suggest that illogicality, if not outright mental illness, drove the actions of the DPRK's leaders. Efforts to understand North Korea's decision-making in the decline and aftermath of the Cold War led policymakers to start describing it as a crazed rogue state working with Iran, Libya, and Iraq to undermine the free world writ large, what the Reagan administration would term in the mid-1980s, quote, a league of terror, the ideological forefather to George W. Bush's axis of evil. The leaders of the DPRK, many Americans feared, did not simply seek to, quote unquote, liberate the South, but they sought to wage an incomprehensible war on civilization as a consequence of their own irrationality. And that effort had only relatively little to do with Korea per se. Of course, the DPRK's frequent use of disturbing, often morally repugnant violence to attempt to achieve its political goals helped drive these core assumptions about North Korea's leaders. But so too did U.S. perceptions of American society and its place in the broader free world. With little understanding of the broader scope of U.S. history, U.S. citizens often viewed Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il through the lens of broader U.S. efforts to stop the spread of communism, and from the 1980s onward, to combat a global network of crazed terrorist states. Those perceptions often filtered through distinctly racialized language, distracted from the reality that an alternative manifestation of Korean nationalism, as well as a ruthless quest for political power, most shaped the decision-making of the DPRK's leaders. The inability of many Americans to recognize these facts have since encouraged one-dimensional views of the North Korean leadership that have made the possibility of pragmatic engagement between Washington and Pyongyang that much more difficult to achieve. One of the first articles about Kim Il-sung to appear in the U.S. media surfaced in January 1946, 2 months after Kim's first major speech in Pyongyang on October 14th, 1945. One headline for that Associated Press article printed across the country described the new leader as a rough and tumble, quote, Asiatic Paul Bunyan, quote, a newly arrived character as colorful and as controversial as ever figured in a mystery drama. Kim Il-sung, the Newswire story stated, was, quote, a shadowy figure viewed by conservatives in Korea as a faker, someone who had assumed the name of a famed anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter. Quote, real or imposter, general or politician, this man may someday become a powerful figure in Korea, the article concluded presciently. However, the possibility that Kim might have been a real guerrilla leader, that Korean nationalism might have driven his resistance to Japanese rule, quickly fell by the wayside. Over the first months of 1946, South Korean and U.S. military officials in Seoul said that Kim Il-sung to the New York Times was only a Soviet pawn, that he was someone who had stolen the identity of a real, long-dead anti-Japanese fighter. Quote, an erstwhile general, as the Times described it. Quote, cow-licked, cow-eyed Kim, to use the words of Time magazine in February 1948, was nothing more than, quote, a plump puppet. Following the creation of 2 Korean states and the outbreak of the Korean War by June 1950, the Truman administration and the vast majority of the American media took it as a matter of course that the only reason the North Korean invasion had occurred was because Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong had ordered it on behalf of a global communist plot. Kim Il-sung and the local dynamics of Korea, so many believed, had had almost nothing to do with those events. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, for instance, perceived the invasion in an exclusively global context as, quote, an undisguised challenge to our internationally accepted position as the protector of South Korea by a Soviet puppet. No one considered that Kim Il-sung's regime, as declassified documents now demonstrate, was the driving force behind the attack. After South Korean and U.S. forces landed at Incheon in September 1950 and then invaded the DPRK, sources in the American media often mocked Kim Il-sung in both racial and ideological terms. Where was Kim Bucktooth? General Douglas MacArthur wanted to know when he visited the city in October 1950. All that was certain, Time later told its readers, was that Kim was, quote, a fat, sleepy-eyed communist boss. The New York Times also offered thinly veiled racial language to describe Kim, deriding him as, quote, a heavy-eyed, paunchy protege of the Kremlin. The North Korean these portrayals suggested had no national initiative of his own, only, quote, sleepy eyes and, quote, oriental submissiveness to distinguish himself from his masters in the Kremlin. Other articles in the U.S. media always return to two core arguments about Kim. The narrative went that, one, he was an imposter who had stolen the name of a legitimate Korean guerrilla who fought the Japanese in the 1930s, and two, that he was only a communist puppet working on behalf of the Kremlin. Such descriptions of Kim Il-sung represented an inherent negation of a Korean communist worldview, regardless of the fact that Kim was installed by Moscow, that he was trained by the Soviet Army, and that he did hold a rank in the Red Army prior to 1945, a captain. No journalist in the mainstream press discussed the potential of Korean nationalism or history in his decision-making. Kim only carried out Moscow's wishes from the American perspective. Thus, such media portrayals of the North Korean leader often served no purpose other than to reinforce a Cold War caricature of a politically impotent, quote, sleepy-eyed racial other, what U.S. News and World Report described as, quote, a mere instrument for transmitting Moscow's orders. These views, which Kim's increasingly independent actions over the latter half of the 1950s and the 1960s would prove mistaken, took shape in the context of racial stereotypes about the passivity of, quote, Orientals in general. As General Douglas MacArthur pontificated at the time, Asians were, quote, supposed to be obedient, dutiful, childlike, and quick to follow resolute leadership. The similar perspectives of ranking policymakers, from Truman to Acheson to Kennan, emerged from older constructions of, quote, Asiatics in U.S. society. These views, alongside the actual events of the Korean conflict, reinforced the conviction that Kim Il-sung merely served the Kremlin's designs for global conquest in the Cold War. His actions had little to do with Korea from that perspective. Throughout the remainder of the 1950s and the 1960s, or the early 1960s, sources in the press continued to depict Kim in a similar manner, who the New York Times described to do in 1961 as, quote, that sleepy-eyed, rotund North Korean, a foreign puppet. Only when new hostilities erupted across the Korean DMZ from 1966 to 1969 did press commentators consider the possibility that Kim might be an independent leader after all, over whom Moscow and Beijing had limited influence. The DPRK's waxing and waning relationships with Beijing and Moscow amid the Sino-Soviet split, alongside a 1966 declaration of independence from the North Korean government in Nodong Shimun, emphasized that Pyongyang would not follow the dictates of any foreign power. And this led in turn to a growing number of sources in the U.S. media to contemplate maybe North Korea's leadership is capable of independent action. Following mounting North Korean raids across the DMZ from the fall of 1966 onward, Time told its readers, quote, the man behind these actions is Kim Il-sung, North Korea's shrewd premier. Intelligence agencies urged the same recognition from the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. The DPRK, 1967 national intelligence estimate urged the administration to recognize, had initiated a new round of hostilities independently of its allies in a bid to destabilize and hopefully overthrow South Korea. North Korea acted alone. In January 1968, North Korea's attempted assassination of RRK President Park Chung-hee and its subsequent seizure of the USS Pueblo led a number of sources in the American press to follow that line of reasoning. The real question, William L. Ryan of the Associated Press stated during the first days of the Pueblo crisis, is, quote, whether the present taunting of the American eagle is Kim Il-sung's own idea, question mark. Quote, despite Kim's reputation for a lack of originality, Ryan told his readers, this phase of the tension perhaps can be attributed to North Korean initiative. The Johnson administration, linking the Pueblo seizure with the Vietnam War and continued fears of an international communist conspiracy, had little interest in that initiative. North Korea, many still believed in the White House, took orders from abroad. The puppet narrative died hard. When President Richard Nixon took office the following year, after the resolution of the Pueblo crisis, and North Korea shot down a U.S. EC-121 spy plane over the East Sea, killing 31 Americans in April 1869. Thereafter, for the first time, the White House joined media sources in suggesting that Pyongyang had acted apart from Beijing or Moscow. Quote, North Korea has an unusually unpleasant regime which doesn't fit any pattern. It cannot be considered a real satellite of either Russia or China, reflected the New York Times that same month. President Richard Nixon, the news anchor Chet Huntley, informed the public during a broadcast of NBC Evening News, believed that North Korea had acted independently of its allies. Crises like the EC-121 incident, media sources suggested in a burgeoning new narrative, was what Americans could expect from North Korea's deranged leadership. Quote, it is not likely, NBC Evening News told its viewers, that Moscow will persuade the North Koreans to behave more rationally. There is not much that can be done with the North Koreans. The DPRK, a Newswire columnist, added, is, quote, the most unpredictable, isolated, heavy-handed, and suspicious regime, communist or non-communist, in the world, end quote. Kim Il-sung's government, the columnist continued, is so anti-American that it makes any other enemy, even North Vietnam, look at least somewhat rational, end quote. This was the beginning of a growing tendency in the United States to depict North Korea as not just brutal, but as actually crazy. The puppet construct gave way to an insanity caricature centered on Kim Il-sung as Americans found themselves bewildered about the sources of North Korean conduct, so to speak. If North Korea was not acting in the service of an international communist conspiracy, but yet continued to launch attacks against South Korea in an effort to destabilize its government, what could it be trying to achieve? Still, throughout the 1970s, the decline and aftermath of the Vietnam War gave rise to suggestions in the U.S. media that Kim Il-sung's government might be open to some form of detente with the White House. This was especially true after the Nixon administration succeeded in a rapprochement with China, and after South and North Korea issued an unprecedented joint statement calling for peaceful reunification in July 1972. Life magazine, for instance, noted that, quote, North Korea, which outdoes even Albania as the ugliest of the communist uglies, now wants to negotiate, end quote. The last surviving Stalinist, added the New York Times of Kim, quote, sought to persuade the outside world that he is a moderate statesman seeking peace. Time remained skeptical. It reiterated in June 1975 that Kim is, quote, xenophobic, chauvinistic, ambitious, egocentric, and thoroughly unpredictable, a combustible mix and a man with a modern army of nearly 500,000 and reserves of 2 million at his command. Regardless of such concerns, President Jimmy Carter's subsequent election and inauguration in January 1977 reinforced hopes that the U.S. and the DPRK might find a way to reduce tensions. This was particularly true after Carter announced a staged withdrawal of U.S. ground forces from South Korea in March 1977 and publicly expressed interest in better relations with Pyongyang. Carter's troop withdrawal plan stalled over the next 2 years, however, due to diverse factors. These included new warnings about the size of the North Korean military and their positioning along the DMZ, but also fears about the rationality of Kim Il-sung. Indeed, the president found most senior officials, even within his own administration, steadfastly opposed to his withdrawal plan. In July 1977, for instance, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General George S. Brown, told the House Armed Services Committee, as the press would report to the country, that the Joint Chiefs had urged Carter to maintain at least a small number of U.S. ground forces in South Korea. General Brown went on to tell the committee that a new invasion of South Korea in the absence of U.S. troops would happen only in the event of, quote, an irrational act or a serious miscalculation on the part of North Korea. The general then added unnervingly, quote, the past history of Kim Il-sung has led to some doubts about his being rational all the time, end quote. Such comments, alongside widespread concerns in the U.S. media about the intentions of the North Korean government, added doubts about Kim Il-sung's mental health to fears over whether North Korea might risk a new invasion of South Korea, something that we now know Kim Il-sung had been looking for an opportunity to do in the mid-1970s. The rise of Kim Jong-il as his father's successor thereafter, in October 1980, only exacerbated fears about the North Korean leadership following Carter's indefinite postponement of his withdrawal plan in 1979. The statements of ROK officials in the U.S. media thereafter encouraged the public to perceive the younger Kim as far more dangerous for the stability of the divided Korean peninsula. Kim Jong-il, South Korean officials warned U.S. journalists in the fall of 1980 was far more aggressive than Kim Il-sung, quote, a dangerous figure, as one unnamed South Korean analyst told the Washington Post, who would, quote, show less restraint than his father in military adventures. At least Kim Il-sung, South Korean President Chun Doo-han, told Time in April 1981, had directly experienced the cataclysm of the Korean War, but his son, quote, does not know what fear means, does not know the horror of war, end quote. The following year, South Korean officials heightened this rhetoric, describing Kim Jong-il to the AP as, quote, more radical, more extreme-minded than his father, an individual who would, quote, bring about a sharpened state of confrontation in Korea. If the younger Kim would indeed prove more willing than ever to undertake new provocations against South Korea, short of all-out war, disquieting statements like these enabled the South Korean government to appeal to existing anxieties in the United States about North Korean unpredictability, while also distracting observers from Seoul's repressive policies towards dissidents demanding political freedom in the South. After North Korean agents nearly assassinated ROK President Chun with a repugnant bombing in Rangoon, Burma, on October 9, 1983, a December 1983 story in the Washington Post reinforced fears about Kim Jong-il by attributing the attack to him and his potential insanity. Quote, I have always thought that Kim Il-sung is not a pleasant fellow, said a U.S. diplomat to the Washington Post, but I've never thought he was a madman. The young North Korean leader, South Korean officials told the Christian Science Monitor in this regard, is the creature of a sycophantic domestic climate with no real outside influences to balance any irrational behavior. Rangoon seemed a preview of what was to come. These concerns proved tragically accurate 4 years later when 2 North Korean agents blew up a South Korean airliner, killing 115 innocent people. Allegations surfaced about Kim Jong-il's involvement in the aftermath. By January 1988, Newswire services reported that a captured North Korean agent had confessed to carrying out the bombing under, quote, Kim's direct orders. Quote, was the pampered prince behind the bombing? Asked the Christian Science Monitor as a result. In the months and years that followed, U.S. and South Korean officials, as well as the popular media, made it clear that they certainly thought that was the case amid mounting fears about Kim Jong-il's mental health. If Kim's alleged decision to blow up a civilian airliner was a far cry from what the vast majority of people would consider anything near rational behavior, that terrorist attack did not necessarily mean that he or his father no longer had a self-interest in their own survival, or more specifically, that they would be unable to make calculated decisions to preserve the DPRK's existence as a sovereign political entity. Those acts were atrocious and ultimately terrible for the North Korean government and the global community, but they did not necessarily mean that the rise of Kim Jong-il would make war inevitable in Korea. They did not mean the certainty of a coming cataclysm. Still, popular U.S. sources in the 1980s described Kim Jong-il as the embodiment of an irrational terror state that no longer could be understood in the context of the Cold War, which for many Americans made this behavior that much more baffling. If the U.S. press had long expressed outrage at North Korean brutality, Kim's rise to power suggested that one of the most puzzling states in the world might soon drag the United States into a nuclear war in East Asia. After the end of the Cold War and the events of the Persian Gulf War in the first months of 1991, the New York Times joined U.S. officials in describing North Korea as the United States' principal post-Cold War adversary, as a rogue state determined to develop nuclear weapons and imperil the security of East Asia and beyond. The threat of the North Korean nuclear program, as many media sources described it, was less about the desperation of the DPRK's ruling regime to survive in a post-Cold War world, and more about the irrationality of its leaders and their determination to threaten civilization at large. Sources in the U.S. media focused those fears on Kim Jong-il before, during, and after the first Korean nuclear crisis from 1993 to 1994. A March 1992 article in the Washington Post titled "North Korea Loose Nuclear Cannon," for instance, asked readers, what would happen when Kim Jong-il, a man who has, quote, lived a life of isolation and ignorance, took the reins of a nuclear North Korea, already running the North's nuclear program, the Post told its readers. Kim is, quote, a paranoid hermit bent on amassing a nuclear arsenal and capable of tragic miscalculation, end quote. The dear leader, an article in Newsweek added the following month, is, quote, a heartbeat away from controlling a renegade state that may be the world's next nuclear power, end quote. As one analyst told the magazine, quote, we know Kim Il-sung, he's not crazy. His son is something else, end quote. This emphasis on Kim Jong-il's mental health, as much as concerns about nuclear proliferation or the international nuclear non-proliferation regime, heightened worries over whether such a leader would leave the U.S. no choice but to fight a new war in Korea. Such statements continue to focus on the unpredictable mindset of a potentially crazed dictator, rather than the shifting political dynamics of the divided Korean peninsula itself. North Korea's nuclear program seemed only a manifestation of Kim Jong-il's insanity rather than a consequence of Pyongyang's insecurity, which was dramatically exacerbated after the collapse of the Soviet Union and other communist states around the world. As a result, the caricaturization of Kim overshadowed a more complex discussion on why North Korea might want to acquire nuclear weapons in the first place. But the rational thing Newsweek told its readers in March 1993 would be for Kim to now end his drive for nuclear weapons. Quote, whether Kim Jong-il and his country are rational appears to be another question entirely, end quote. The U.S., another publication reflected, could seek to deter a nuclear North Korea with the threat of massive retaliation, but, quote, deterrence presupposes dealing with a rational opponent, which is not always the case. The world's Muammar Gaddafi's and Kim Jong-il's spring to mind, end quote. Such articles raised questions about whether North Korea's leaders were capable of maintaining the peace as Pyongyang prepared to leave the nuclear proliferation treaty that spring. North Korea's leaders, many Americans feared, did not have a calculated strategy rooted incomprehensible self-interest, such as survival. The emphasis instead was on extremism in the Third World, a broader geopolitical context that ultimately distracted from a more nuanced analysis of North Korea's worldview. Comparisons between Kim Jong-il and Muammar Gaddafi did little to help the public understand the historical and ideological factors in Korea that shaped the decision-making of the North Korean state. Pyongyang, not Tripoli, held all of the answers. Seeking to make sense of this budding nuclear crisis in December 1993, Russell Watson of Newsweek described North Korea's leaders as, quote, nuclear bomb builders defying the White House in manic isolation. This latter, distinctly psychopathological phrasing implied that North Korea's isolation had given its leadership a warped worldview that made them incapable of understanding that they shouldn't be pursuing nuclear weapons. Watson encouraged this perspective by drawing on television and cultural nostalgia, describing the Kims as, quote, the Addams family of global politics. He stated, quote, their North Korea is a haunted house, so isolated from the rest of the world, so secretive in its dealings, that there is no way for outsiders to know why the rulers do what they do, end quote. This suggestion that it was impossible to understand North Korea's actions discouraged Americans from reflecting on the potential reasons behind the DPRK's efforts to attain nuclear weapons. It was easier instead to dismiss Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il's decisions as baffling and crazy. It was in this context that a number of voices on both sides of the political spectrum urged the U.S. government to ready itself for preemptive war after intelligence officials declared at the end of 1993 that Pyongyang probably already had 1 or 2 atomic bombs. The Clinton administration seriously considered launching airstrikes against North Korea's nuclear facilities thereafter. Could the U.S. win a new war on the Korean Peninsula? President Bill Clinton inquired in the White House. U.S. General Gary Luck, the commander of U.S. forces in Korea, answered affirmatively, but at the cost of an estimated 1 million Korean lives, 30,000 U.S. casualties, and $1 trillion in damage, leading to an economic catastrophe in Korea and beyond. Alas, American fears of North Korea's leadership and the perception that war might be inevitable nearly led itself to a self-fulfilling prophecy of a second war in Korea, as the Clinton administration had seriously considered launching the first blow. After the nuclear crisis peaked in June 1994 and Kim Il-sung died the following month, the national media described Kim Jong-il more than ever before as potentially crazy and cast widespread doubt about whether the Clinton administration could negotiate with that leader for any productive purpose. Journalists Bill Powell and Peter McCullough of Newsweek summed up what observers, including American officials, had to say about the younger Kim. Quote, Jong-il is among the world's most shadowy figures. In the words of one U.S. diplomat, he is irrational, far more dangerous than his father, with no sense of how to deal with the forces and problems that surround him, all of which are formidable, end quote. Readers could surmise that Kim Jong-il not only had the potential to start a new war, but he was actually incapable of understanding the domestic and foreign policy challenges confronting him. The North Korean leader was not a political actor, for better or for worse, who had the ability to shape his country's future as he saw fit. Kim could only be a product of broader forces beyond his control, including his own irrationality. A slightly more sober article in Newsweek portrayed Kim as a childlike figure in need of strong parental authority and as a stereotypical third world dictator with an insatiable libido. Could Washington, readers may have wondered, in turn, negotiate with such an enemy? Was there any point in trying? The October 1994 agreed framework between the United States and North Korea, though a significant testament to the possibility of pragmatic engagement to avoid war, did little to diminish the belief of many Americans that any form of cooperation with the DPRK was impossible. Repeated statements in the U.S. media over the second half of the 20th century that North Korea's leaders were either puppets of their allies or innately irrational had significant implications for U.S. foreign policy towards Pyongyang that have lasted into the present. Diverse political, military, economic factors all played a role. So did the behavior of the North Korean government, of course. But these views, which profoundly shaped how Americans, from the White House to Main Street USA, had significant consequences for U.S. foreign policy. These reductive caricatures of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il helped define the interest at stake for Washington and its allies. They created an overly simplistic global context in which policymakers and journalists looked away from Korea as they grappled with the meaning of North Korea's actions. The puppet narrative and the frequent suggestion that the Kims were irrational, for example, played an important role in shaping the parameters of U.S. policy towards North Korea. In the 2 decades after the Korean War, for instance, U.S. citizens, even in spite of the resounding bitterness of that conflict on all sides, had little incentive to support high-level diplomacy with Pyongyang. After all, many believed that Moscow or Beijing controlled the DPRK. In turn, U.S. policies aimed at containing North Korea as the sword tip of an international communist menace, which led, for example, to the stationing of American nuclear weapons in South Korea from 1958 to 1992, heightened Pyongyang's already extreme insecurity. As the satellite narrative subsided in the late 1960s, and indirect U.S. DPRK diplomatic contacts began in the 1970s, media portrayals that attributed North Korea's actions to the irrationality of its leaders helped encourage many U.S. officials and press commentators to reject initiatives such as the significant reduction of U.S. forces from South Korea that might have spurred on cooperation or perhaps reduced tensions. A number of U.S. administrations, beginning with Jimmy Carter's, opened themselves up to a potential rapprochement with the DPRK, but constructions of North Korea's leadership as irrational, often reinforced by the DPRK's own actions, made the idea of detente between Washington and Pyongyang seem absurd, even if Kim Il-sung's regime had been willing to commit itself faithfully to that process. Such fears dramatically heightened the obstacles facing President Bill Clinton when he sought to negotiate and then implement the 1994 agreed framework. In the present day, a never-ending series of vitriolic comments from Pyongyang, and of course the DPRK's recent nuclear and ballistic missile test, have done little to diminish American fears about the current North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. U.S. DPRK cooperation does not seem likely anytime soon. However, continued suggestions in the popular American media that Kim Jong-un is either a child, in over his head, or a lunatic, or as we've heard this fall throughout the presidential campaign, that China really has the ability to control North Korea if only it makes the effort, that China can resolve North Korea's nuclear program if we can work with them to do that. These views continue a long pattern of negating the rational and nationalistic agency of North Korea's leadership, with popular assumptions of Kim Jong-un's irrationality in particular. A distinction has to be made between behavior we consider morally repugnant and something that is akin to outright insane action. This remains true at a time in which the North Korean regime is still committed to ensuring the survival of the DPRK and threatening the prosperity and stability of South Korea. The immense complexities of the Korean Peninsula offer no easy answers when it comes to responding to North Korea's actions. But U.S. citizens should recognize that its leadership, as former diplomat Joel Witt said in the New York Times in January 2016, that the North Korean leadership makes strategic decisions based on perceived national interest. In their own way, they are akin to foreign policy realists. But if Americans are to accept that reality, I would put forward 3 points that the public and the government needs to reflect on, which is 1, that America and Americans need to assess how North Korea's actions relate to its own insecurity and its nationalistic objectives. 2, to consider that Pyongyang follows a very dangerous but ultimately comprehensible nuclear strategy. And 3rd, to analyze the DPRK's decision-making in the context of Korea and its tragic history over the 20th century. to not let a larger global environment obscure the more nuanced complexities ongoing on that divided peninsula. If Americans are to accept these facts and to help prevent another tragic cataclysm on the Korean Peninsula, they have to reassess the fundamental misperceptions about North Korea's leadership that have so often informed U.S. foreign policy since the Korean War. In this regard, I believe the sobriety of dispassionate historical scholarship is more needed than ever. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That was an excellent session. Please give Brandon Gauthier a warm round of applause. As a thank you, we'd just like to present you with the book from Ambassador Chung-Min Lee, Rising
Wonderful.
Fault Lines in Asia. So I hope you enjoy this.
Thank you very much. I would just like to say thank you again to Nikki and Stephen Norper for the opportunity to speak today. It's a great pleasure. Thank you again all for coming.
If you've enjoyed this program, there's a brief survey. It'll take you less than a minute to complete. Please do fill that out for us and so that we can continue to improve our programs. Check out our calendar. Join us as members on koreasociety.org. Thank you very much.